Alrighty. Let's get started here. Okay, so last time on Friday, we were talking about some of the concepts and theories, and hopefully we will get done with that today and move into our next topic, which is just some basics on how to do social research. Wow, that thermos keeps things very hot. Okay, so a couple quick questions here that we had from last time. So can you make money in gender studies? I have no idea. I'm not an expert in the finances of people doing gender studies. I think okay, here. Will you be tested on information from the textbook? Only where it overlaps with the class, as I've said a few times, right? But anything that's in the textbook that I didn't talk about in class, no worries about. And then, how am I doing today? Well, it's Monday. Less good than Friday, but still pretty good. The weather's definitely better. So, and there's snow, so I can go out and do some cross-country skiing this week, and it should be pretty grand. Busy, but I have 3 kids, so life is just busy and kind of hectic. My son had Taekwondo testing this weekend, so I spent a good 2.5 hours watching like 70 kids do Taekwondo, which is super fun. Exactly what everyone wants to do with their weekend, I'm sure. But he did a good job. Okay, this comment, I think feminist theory is a bit more important. This is giving babies toys and stuff. Right, I'm not saying it is just giving babies toys and stuff. I'm just saying this is an example of sort of how feminists think, right? It's that socialization and how we socialize young people plays a major role in how they act later on, right? So that if we give, boys, stereotypical boy toys, things that are, kind of based on movement, right? And that they're going to develop spatial awareness and be more rough and tumble. And this plays a role in how we think about masculinity. And femininity is shaped by the way we treat young girls as well. And that these have these long chain effects in society, right? So that when we get to the end of high school, it's like, oh, girls are more stereotypically emotional and, empathetic. So we kind of track them into, stereotypically female jobs like teaching, nursing, and social work. And that's the sort of basic feminist argument, that these roles that we impose in childhood have this long tail effect throughout life and ultimately shape a lot of things. Okay. All right, I'm not going to make us watch this video again, but basically, right, that was the idea in this video, is that people have these stereotypes about how children should be treated and what kind of toys they should have, and that ultimately those things fundamentally shape their outcomes later in life. Okay. Now, none of that is unassailable, right? There are certainly counter arguments. Oh, I don't want to play that again. There are certainly counter arguments around, but that is definitely the feminist argument. Okay, yeah, when we talk about feminism, right, we didn't really see feminism playing a major role in the universities until really the 1960s, right? The 1960s, like the period between 1960 and 1973 is probably one of the most tumultuous periods in the history of Canada and the US in terms of changes in social roles and thinking about social roles, right? Where we have the anti-war movement, we have the sexual revolution really kicking off with in the US, the approval of the birth control pill in 1960, the civil rights movement sort of coming into its maturity in lots of ways, and you'll get things like the Equal Rights Amendment and the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s in the US. And all of these things are all culminating. And feminism is part of that wave, and it becomes a major kind of part of academic thinking after that, right? So feminist theory, right, in a nutshell, the main source of gender inequality includes differences in the way boys and girls are reared, right? It includes, it's not exclusive of it, which creates all sorts of other things along the chain, right, along the life course. Barriers to equal opportunity in education, paid work, right, and especially like in the 1960s, it was kind of assumed that women weren't allowed in professions like engineering, medicine, engineering medicine. There's another one the law, right? That it was just not a place for women. Work and politics, right? And the unequal division of domestic responsibilities between women and men. This is a long complaint of feminists that, especially since women started to go back to work while they had young children at home, really starting in the 1950s, that women were responsible for both being in the workforce and having a shift out in the workforce and the bulk of domestic responsibilities, right? So they were doing most of the emotional work with children and elderly parents. They were doing most of the cleaning, cooking, and other work of what conflict theorists would call social reproduction, right? Just keeping the family going. Okay, so we're getting on to the end of this unit. So maybe a little bit of a thought experiment to end off with. What does this all look like, right? When we take, a real world phenomenon, how would each of these different schools, look at that phenomenon in different ways, right? Now, again, one of the things I'll say is sociologists will tend to kind of move themselves into camps, right? And be like, I'm a conflict theorist, I'm a functionalist, I'm a symbolic interactionist, or a social constructionist. All of these things, right, if we instrumentalize them, right, if we tool them, hour 3 of talking, if we turn them all into tools, right, we can kind of appreciate each of them for telling us certain things. Okay, so one of the examples that we can think about here is the fashion cycle, right? So we know that all the time, right, there are new fashions coming out. Every clothing store and every manufacturer of clothing has its, fall lineup and its spring lineup, its summer lineup, and its winter lineup, right? They're all clothes for different seasons, and the styles change a little bit, right? And there is such a thing as people wanting to keep up with whatever is fashionable at the time, right? And it's broadly dictated by, elites in Paris, I guess Milan and New York, right? Where they have the kind of great fashion companies. And it then kind of trickles down, from there to, to the stores like Zara and other kind of trendy stores, and then all the way down to Walmart and Costco eventually. So how would this be read by different kind of schools of sociology, right? This constant kind of churning of fashions and the fact that fashion changes all the time. Okay, so functionalists, right? Again, for functionalists, one of the key things is that everything that happens in society, right, every aspect of society exists for a reason. And they mostly view these things as having emerged kind of organically, right? That basically, it didn't emerge because some, scheming capitalist thought we should have a fashion cycle. It just sort of happened, right? Why? Because there are people who are interested in making clothing for other people, and they produce clothing, and out of that comes a fashion cycle. One of the ways that functionalists, though, might read the fashion system is that fashion performs an important social function in helping to maintain an orderly class system, right? So obviously, right, when you see someone's clothing, for the most part, you will get a certain idea about who they are, right? And where they sit in the kind of fashion cycle, right? So if you had, me and one of my closest friends, right? So he's a plumber, right? He would be standing here in Carhartts and, work boots and all of this kind of stuff, right? And I'm obviously standing here in a dress shirt and slacks. That's going to tell you something immediately. You look at the two of us next to each other, you're probably immediately going to be like, Matt is working class. Jeff is, a white collar worker, right? And that would be exactly right? The fashions that we wear, the things that we have, right, are going to tell you certain things, right? Now, when you get up to, really high in the fashion cycle, obviously people who have more money, right, who are in the kind of upper middle class and upper class, they wear different kinds of clothing, right? So, you look at a politician or a rich businessman, right? They're not wearing a cheap suit from, Moores, right? They're getting their suits from Armani, or there's probably better ones. I'm not much of a fashion guy, but they're getting better suits, right? Suits that look nicer, that are tailored, that come from, Italy or some such place, or Brooks Brothers, whatever it happens to be, right? Same with women's clothing, right? There are tiers, right? And there's obviously, those brands that are at the top of the fashion cycle, right? That have the most trendy clothing, that are the highest quality, and all of those things, shoes that cost hundreds of dollars or more, Jimmy Choos and such. And each of those things are going to tell you where the person who owns those things kind of sits in the social order according to functionalists, right? Now, again, it just helps us differentiate, right? It helps us know where everyone's place is, right? When I walk into the class, I'm wearing a dress shirt. We immediately know that I'm the professor. You're all wearing, student attire. We know that you're the students, right? And that helps us maintain proper order in this classroom because from the moment I walked in on day one that you're supposed to be paying attention to me. Also, I'm old and bald and kind of probably not a student. So those things too, right? That would be a kind of functionalist reading. Okay, conflict theory, a little bit different reading again. Now, conflict theory, and you find this, principally in places or in the writings of people like Marcuse. Marcuse, I think Herbert Marcuse. I was just looking at his book on my bookshelf yesterday and wondering if I read it in grad school, and I was wondering if I should throw it away or donate it or something or keep it on my shelf. Anyway, Marcuse wrote a book called One-Dimensional Man, and he outlines the kind of conflict theory approach to stuff like the fashion cycle. And basically what Marcuse says is that things like fashion serve a function in capitalism, specifically, essentially to keep you working, right? So what Marcuse would say is that, capitalism is really, really good at offering you, what you need to live, right? So capitalism has made clothing readily available, shelter readily available, food readily available. But in a kind of normal world, according to Marcuse, once you have purchased enough clothing to put on your back, a shelter, a car, and enough food to put in your belly, you probably don't need to keep buying things, right? So in order for the capitalist system to keep going in conflict theory, it needs to generate things that you think you need but don't actually need so that you keep buying stuff. Okay, so there's two reasons for this in conflict theory, right? First, if the ruling class is going to continue to make a profit, right, then they're going to need to keep selling you stuff, right? You need to keep wanting to buy stuff. So they're going to generate something like the fashion cycle that's going to tell you that clothes that you have that's still perfectly functional, right? You have that hoodie that you've had since 10th grade in high school. It still fits. It's the most comfortable shirt you own. You're the most happy when you're wearing it. And yet, the fashion cycle will say, yeah, but that hoodie's so 3 years ago or 4 years ago or 5 years ago or whatever, right? And so you actually need this new thing from American Eagle or whatever, right? Not because you actually need more clothing, right? And I think, if you look at kind of critiques of fast fashion and the fashion industry in general, we all have way more clothing than we need, right? We've built houses with massive closets because, modernity sort of has us stuck with this big problem of I have all this clothes, way more clothes than I can ever wear. What do I do with it? Well, let me build a bigger part of my house to house all of it. But you don't actually need it. So why do you keep buying it? Well, according to conflict theory, because A, it makes sure that you're always contributing to the profit of the people who make the clothing, right? So you're always buying new clothes, which keeps their profits going. And it also sort of keeps you enslaved, right? Through this creation of false consciousness and false need, right? Because you don't need these things, and the idea that you do for Marxists is kind of a false idea or a false consciousness. So from this idea, it also kind of keeps you enslaved because you end up working way longer than you otherwise would have to, right? If all you had to do was supply your basic needs, right? You already have clothes, you already have food, and now you just need, basically to keep buying more food and all of that, we wouldn't need to work nearly as hard, right? We wouldn't need to work potentially 40 hours a week or more to support ourselves. But it's the need for all of these things that are constantly changing that keeps us kind of enslaved to capitalism. You go to your 9-to-5 job because you need to keep buying the new fashion or the new, right? Think about the iPhone or any other kind of phone, but the iPhone I think is notorious for this, right? It's like the iPhone, whatever the hell it is now, the 14 Pro or whatever, and this is always the sales pitch that Apple makes. It's like, wow, this makes the Apple 13 Pro look obsolete and useless in comparison, right? What a piece of junk that old iPhone was that we made a mere 12 months ago and that you purchased for, nary one of your internal organs. But it's, why do we keep buying it? Well, because they create this idea that you need it. Now, Marcuse will also talk about things like planned obsolescence as part of capitalism too, right? So while they could build you an iPhone that's going to last 10 years, or a laptop, or say a laptop unlike mine and most of yours, where you could easily remove the battery and throw a new one in there when the battery fails, they build these things that are basically built to fail, right? Marcuse criticized the car companies for this. He said car companies could build cars that would last 25 years, right, or more, right? You could be driving the same car for decades, but they build cars that are designed to break. Why? So that I think at one point it was like every 5 years or so. Now I think because cars are so expensive, it's up to like 13 is the average length of car ownership. But every 13 years, you have to go and drop, 20, 30 grand on a new vehicle. Not because your old one wasn't great and didn't do everything you needed, but because capitalism sort of designed it to break, right? And when you buy your crappy clothes from H&M and, after 2 years, it's ratty and it starts to rip because it's fast fashion, right? Again, that's planned obsolescence. It's made cheaply so that it fails, so that you have to replace it. Okay. So, symbolic interactionism. How would it read the fashion cycle? A little bit differently again. So it tells us something different about fashion, about clothing, right? And symbolic interactionism would focus with the fashion cycle about how it helps us express our ever-shifting identities, right? And think about like teenagers, right, with clothing, and how teenagers sort of go through phases, right? Like they are sort of trying on different identities, moving through them, and then, they sort of abandon one identity, and with that identity came a way of dressing, right? And you have whole movements, in terms of teen fashion around certain identities, right? I don't know what they are anymore because I'm too old and my daughter won't talk to me about it. She's 14, literally lives in hoodies and a toque and leggings, which is comfy, but a little slovenly, but she likes it. She's like, I don't want anyone to care about what I'm wearing, so I don't care about what I'm wearing. That's her whole philosophy, right? That says something about her identity. However, at different times, right, I expect in her life, she's gonna put on different things, right? She's gonna try dressing in different ways. Maybe she goes all emo and it's all black makeup and dyed black hair and, all that stuff, dark clothes, trench coats, whatever. But fashion can help us express our identities, right? If you want to make yourself, what is it like? Dress for success, or don't dress for the job you have, dress for the job you want, right? You can project a certain identity and sometimes a certain competence in the way you dress, right? So fashion helps us express who we are in particular ways. All right, and feminism, I love feminism's read on the fashion industry. It's so much fun. I don't know why, but I'm like constantly tempted to like turn these and just see what happens. Like, are they connected? Do they do things? That one says warning, natural gas valve. I probably shouldn't open that then. I just like tempting, I don't know why. It's like, when there's like a red button and it says do not press, and it's like, well, now I really want to press it and just to see what happens. Okay, I won't do that. They just open the natural gas valve and then they got to close a whole other building of the university and chaos ensues, which would be kind of fun actually. Okay, feminism. How does feminism read the fashion industry, right? So fashion is a form of patriarchy. So what feminists have often said about the fashion industry, and particularly the fact that a lot of fashion, and even women's fashion, has been dominated by male designers, right? Folks like Tommy Hilfiger, right, have dominated women's fashion as much as men's fashion in lots and lots of ways. And what they would say is that fashion is just a way of subjecting women to what would be called the male gaze, right? So that fashion, especially like haute couture or, things that are more stylish, are all about making women's bodies more appealing to men by, emphasizing certain female body parts that men tend to find appealing, right? So that the fashion industry is just a form of patriarchy, right? And the fact that there's these differential ways that men and women's fashions sort of have existed historically, right? Women's fashions change a lot more than men's. Men's fashions are really, really boring, right? The shirts are kind of similar. The ties get fatter, they get skinnier. the collars on the shirts get a little bit smaller, the lapels on the suits get a little smaller. That's about it for most of men's fashion. Maybe sometimes pants have pleats. I still have a pair of like really pleated pants in my closet that I dare not break out because they're so 12 years ago. And yet I keep them because they still fit, suggesting to me that I'm not as fat as I think I am. Right, but all of these ways that women's fashion changes is all about having women constantly change their fashion and always kind of emphasizing the female body in really different ways and bringing out whatever kind of aspects are socially kind of desirable at that point, right? If it's low-cut tops, right, that's for the male gaze so that you see more of women's breasts, or tight pants, yoga pants, so you see more of their butts, right? This is all part of essentially the patriarchy's desire to turn women into objects of visual pleasure for men. Okay, so, do I have a question slide? You must have a Toyota or a Honda. Yeah, I mean, okay, so my 2014 Dodge Grand Caravan is having increasing problems. In the cold, it sounds like it's going to have an aneurysm, but the heater's like, yeah! It doesn't really heat anything, but it continues with only, a generous $2,000 to $3,000 of repair every year. Okay, what school of thought do I most identify with? I tend to be more of a functionalist, right? I tend to have more of this sense that a lot of social institutions are there for a reason. Sorry, I have a lot of friends who drive German cars, and like the constant refrain of complaints about how A, how crappy they are, and B, how much they break down and how expensive it is, 100% makes me feel better about the fact that our cars are Ford and Dodge. They break a lot, but they're cheap to fix. Okay, so I'm mostly a functionalist. Like, I tend to think social institutions exist for a reason, and there are major risks in sort of tearing them down willy-nilly, only because I used to be a Marxist, and then, Marxism has a really great track record of destroying social institutions without caring about what the consequences are. I'm shifting a little bit more towards a different and a more modern school of sociology called critical realism. I'm sort of slowly being dragged. Which again, critical realism is more like views all these schools as useful and tries to combine the insights from each of them. This is way more Freudian than I want to get into, and way beyond my pay grade. I mean, it's like, why? I mean, I think from a social, like if you're talking, say, like if you want to talk about Foucault, right? What would Foucault's, everybody would have a different view to this question, right? A functionalist would probably say that historically this has been functional, right? Males being physically stronger than females had to kind of protect them, when you're talking about cultures that had relatively low safety, right? So there was this kind of natural thing where women, before you have birth control, were pregnant a lot, which puts you in a really, or nursing children, which puts you in a really vulnerable situation. So the person who's not pregnant or nursing children kind of had to be the one to step up and defend, which puts them in that superordinate position. That's a more functionalist reading. Obviously, Marxist, it's like men just want all the property and they don't want any competition, so they subjugate women. There's like as many different answers as there are schools of sociology, and it's, I think, an open debate, but there you go. Okay, right. So yeah, each of these schools, I think, tells us something, about the world, right? And I think, like anything else, right, we tend to get siloed into our ways of seeing things, right? Someone who really has a strong bent towards these sorts of economic readings of the world often will come at it from a sort of conflict theory, Marxian sort of perspective. But that doesn't mean it's the right way or the wrong way. I think each of them gives us something, right? And takes something that we often take for granted and shows us a little bit why it's interesting and maybe why it exists, why it's less natural than we think. Okay, so just to kind of close off kind of concepts and theories, we're now entering a kind of new moment in history, right? Especially in the West, we're entering a sort of different phase, right? We're, in a lot of ways, modernity, right? This period of modernity which really starts with the Industrial Revolution and has gone on until today, we're either kind of moving into post-modernity, as some people have been claiming since like the 1980s, or I think more commonly now, people talk about late modernity, right? We're in the late stages of modernity, and we're shifting into what's called the post-industrial revolution, right? Where more and more, fewer, good English there. The jobs that are being created, right? The places that people are going to work are increasingly service-based, right? You're providing services, things like teaching, nursing, medicine, legal expertise, social work, programming, right? Rather than making stuff, right? So we're moving more and more into this era past industrialization. And in the West, a lot of this has been driven by the fact that we've moved the bulk of our industrial jobs off into other parts of the world, principally Asia, right? And we've shifted more of our kind of jobs to these less risky, less dangerous, less physical, white-collar, knowledge-based jobs. And this is one of the kind of the big shifts in human history, and you're living through it right now. The transition from, industrial to post-industrial societies. All righty. Okay, so we're also moving to a world, increasingly of greater and greater individualism, right? With each generation, we're moving more and more to people thinking of themselves as individuals and being more concerned with their individual identities and more social diversity, right? Less conformity over time, a continuingly greater emphasis on either racial, gender, and any kind of diversity you could think. Identity diversity, religious diversity, right? Our societies are becoming more and more diverse. And along with this, right, people are feeling more and more free to construct their identities in any way that they want, right? In any way to suit that. We especially see that with Generation Z, right, or Gen Z. If you think of, a lot of the questions that are happening today around gender identity, right? This was never a concern for other generations because you just sort of were whatever the norm was. But as, we get more and more individualistic, people are starting to question, like, do these categories mean anything? How do I situate myself in these categories, right? How do I think of myself? That's the ultimate question, not what is the norm. And a lot of the cultural battles we see around those kinds of issues are driven precisely by that. It's also driven by increased communication, international migration, more sexual diversity, greater family forms, and all of this, especially technology, right? As more information is available to people, they're more able to cobble together identities from different sources, right? Things that weren't possible in the past, right? Now you can't, in the past, right? Let's say you were born in 1925. Your culture was basically the people around you and a little bit of radio, some print media, right? It was very constrained. Today, if you want to watch a Bollywood movie, it takes you about 15 seconds, or anime, right, from Japan, or anything, right? You can consume culture on a broad basis. And so you can construct your identity from all sorts of cultural sources, right? Not just your own cultural source, not just your own religious background, anything you kind of want at the end of the day. Okay, that said, the modern world is also one possibly that is also shaped by a ton of constraint, right? Some of the possibilities that are opened up by new technologies also come from technologies that sort of force us into similar boxes, right? If you look at any group of teenagers, they all essentially believe the same things. They're all being influenced by the same media, which give them essentially mostly the same ideas, right? And there's really strong pushes towards conformity, right? Buying the same things, owning the same things, having similar kinds of lifestyles, things that are kind of socially valued potentially by capitalism if you're a conflict theorist, right? And driven why, for the benefit of mostly American-owned corporations. Social media, in a lot of ways, drives conformist behavior. It drives people towards a certain set of ideas that are seen as acceptable. And this is, if you think of the so-called phenomenon of cancel culture, that's all really a push towards a form of social conformity, right? I'm not saying cancel culture is as bad as say, people on the right wing say it is, but when you see cancel culture or people coming after people on Twitter for things they said, right, that's a form of pushing conformity. And we can now do it at a massive scale, right? If I say something, let's say I said something racist or sexist in class, someone posts a clip of it on Twitter, and suddenly I could have people from, New York City and Toronto and Halifax and anywhere in the world baying for my job, right? Telling, U of A that I should be fired, right? And that's a push towards a kind of conformity as well. And yeah, potentially, especially, and when we talk about globalization, there's a sort of worry in a lot of globalization discourses that as especially American companies have gone around the world kind of pushing American pop culture everywhere, there's a risk of a kind of degradation of cultural diversity, right? Where everything either is American pop culture, right? You go to Beijing and you can see the latest Marvel movie in the theater, and if you listen to the radio in Warsaw, you're probably listening to Taylor Swift, Beyonce, and a bunch of Western artists at the expense of Polish artists who either have to get pushed out or have to imitate American pop culture to ultimately make it, right? Because they have to compete with the Taylor Swifts of the world, which can mean that those things that make Polish culture distinct ultimately kind of disappear. All right. Is absurdism considered an emergence? I've always thought of absurdism as more of a artistic movement, right? Coming out of things like futurism, absurdism. Yeah, I've always thought of it more as an artistic movement, right? One that sort of shows the absurd and makes everyday things look absurd to show how absurd they actually are. But less of a sociological or philosophical movement than an artistic one, at least in the ways that I know it. I forget what I said right before I said attendant consequences, so if you could remind me. I don't remember. What was I talking about? Okay, do I watch anime? On and off. I've watched anime here and there. I watched like the first 2 seasons of Attack on Titan, and it was good, and then I sort of lost track of it after that. I used to be quite a devotee of the Gundam franchise, but then I realized it was exactly the same story over and over again. Teenagers rebel, fly giant fighting robots. It's kind of awesome. But at some point I ceased being a teenager and maybe it ceased appealing to me as much. I don't watch a ton of it, but yeah, I definitely have watched some anime in my time. And of course, I watched a ton of Pokemon, and I had to go back and find it where Ash finally wins and becomes a Pokemon master and then sails into the sunset. And I now feel no need to watch any Pokemon ever again. Because it was Ash and Pikachu for me, and whoever these new characters are, I don't care. Okay, that's me. All right, that's it. I still don't remember what I was saying when I said attendant consequences. I'm sorry. Sometimes I just say weird phrases. Okay, how much time do I have left? 13 minutes. All right, let's take at least a peek at our next unit. Okay, so this is probably the most exciting unit in the whole course. No, I'm kidding. I try to get this one done as quickly as possible. So this is social research, right? Trying to understand how sociologists do research. And I'm going to go through it really, really quickly, just because I know it's not as interesting as concepts and theory and some of the more grounded things. So let's kind of work through it as fast as we can. Oh, this is probably a question from last semester because I forgot to reset the Slido. Okay, so when we talk about sociology, right? Sociology, as I said kind of towards the beginning of the course, is a social science, right? And it aims ultimately to categorize the social world in the same way as the natural sciences categorize the physical world, right? It wants to basically use scientific thinking and scientific modes of rationality to understand society, right? Now, this has ups and downs, it has certain strengths and certain pitfalls. But that's essentially what it does, right? And at least at its best, right, it wants to reduce as much bias as possible in our thinking about the social world and give us as objective, or as we sometimes call it, intersubjective, right? So between two people's point of views, they should see the same thing based on the data, a view of the world as possible. So it seeks to avoid these 10 common errors referred to as unscientific thinking. Okay, so when we have unscientific thinking, right? They're basically different modes of thought that people tend to use. Now, some of these are heuristics, right? So they are quick and easy ways that people without thinking can sort of characterize the world, right? So without having to, explain everything, every step of your thinking, if everyone sort of accepts these things, they're often, easy ways to sort of understand things about the world, right? But there are all kind of misuses or unscientific ways of viewing the world. Okay, so tradition being one of them, right? So tradition, right, we've always done it this way. We don't need to think about why that is, because we've always done it this way and it's always worked. Therefore, this is the right way things should be done, right? Everybody has always gotten married before they have sex, and that works. That keeps a stable society. That's been the tradition, so we don't need to think about it. We just do it that way, right? Or, chicken soup cures a cold. It doesn't actually work, but it's just a traditional way of thinking about it. Or even things like, this old idea that being out in the cold causes a cold, right? This is a traditional way of thinking, right? It's locked into non-scientific ways of thinking. Okay, arguments from authority or authority, right? As another way, some kind of authority figure says something, and therefore it must be true, right? Now this is one of the most irritating things about a lot of debates at both the academic and the popular level, is that you'll have an argument made that's sort of like this, right? Okay, this study showed that XYZ, right? Whatever it happens to be. Chihuahuas are a fundamentally aggressive and irritating dog, right? And I have this study from the Journal of Popular Petology that shows that the Chihuahua shouldn't be around human beings at any time, right? And they should be extirpated from the earth. I don't like Chihuahuas. I find them very irritating. My friend had a Chihuahua, and it used to, for whatever reason, really not like me. So it would like nibble at my pant legs all the time when I was over there. And so I've developed a great hatred of Chihuahuas in general. When it died, I might have had a small party at my house. I hated you, Chico. I'm glad you are dead. I really hated that dog. Just irritating. I'm super allergic to dogs, and it would also want to jump up on me, which I find super annoying. But all dogs that are annoying want to jump up on me. Anyway, I have an article in the Popular Journal of Petology that says Chihuahuas are sociopathic dogs and should be extirpated from the planet, right? And then I'm like, so because I have this study, therefore let's begin with the Chihuahua Holocaust, right? This is the greatest example I've ever come up with. It's all so much better than all my examples about furries and introduction to social methods. Come take social methods. You'll hear me talk about furries endlessly. Okay, so that's and then, that is an argument from authority, right? I have this study, and there's these scientists who studied Chihuahuas and said they're sociopaths. Now, of course, that doesn't actually mean that there's anything wrong with Chihuahuas, right? It's just that when I claim that somehow they're bad dogs, I'm making an argument from authority, right? Or if it's like the Pope said, or my professor said, instead of addressing the substance of the ideas, right? So, you dig into this study on Chihuahuas and their psychopathy, and you realize that it was done in a super unscientific way. Well, that's critical thinking or scientific thinking. Unscientific thinking is just being like, well, there's a study that says Chihuahuas are bad, so they must be, right? Because you're taking the authority of the author and of, the journal it was published in as the kind of, backup for the truth claim. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I'm sure you will all come out of this class thinking about the Chihuahua Holocaust, and you'll never forget. The funnier the example, sometimes the better you remember it. Okay, so casual observation. I remember when I was growing up, my dad insisted that everyone who drove a Toyota with a golden emblem was a terrible driver. Why? Because, and I remember, because he used to drive me to school, especially at university, and so we would drive on the white mud, from the West End, and he would be like, oh, another gold-plated Toyota, or gold logo Toyota, that person's a terrible driver. Now, why? Because he had observed, in some cases, what he suggested was terrible driving on the part of people with these gold emblems on their Toyotas. I don't know why it was a thing. I hear this a lot too, right? People who drive Ram trucks are terrible drivers, right? Or whatever it happens to be. Now that one might actually be true, I don't know. Based on my recent experiences on the Hyundai maybe. But that's a casual observation, right? You actually don't have in your casual observations of the world, you actually don't have a really good handle on the broader picture of society, right? You actually only have the little snippets that you observe when you're paying attention, right? So let's say I think that all people who drive Dodge Ram trucks are terrible drivers. That's probably partially driven by the fact that in those moments that I'm paying attention and not fiddling with the radio or yelling at my children in the car to stop poking each other or insulting each other or whatever it happens to be, right? Oh, some Dodge Ram truck cuts me off. I'm like, stupid Ram truck driver. And then, 3 weeks later, that happens again. And out of these very casual observations that I'm making, not really paying attention to the world, I make these broad, sweeping statements, right? But I didn't notice that, in all of those other moments, there are Dodge Ram truck drivers driving around me perfectly safely. It's only in those kind of moments that I was paying attention that I saw these things, and why, in this case, probably because something happened that drew my attention to it, right? And not paying attention to all the moments where people drove, perfectly normally in Dodge Ram trucks. Okay. Overgeneralization, right? Often overgeneralization is taking either the exception or a small group of exceptions, or a small group of examples and making it the rule, right? Like I knew, I'm trying to think of a good example here, right? I knew this guy who was poor now he owns a car dealership. So anyone who basically works hard, goes to school, keeps their nose clean, can ultimately end up being rich, right? It's a kind of overgeneralization, right? I'm taking one particular example or a few sets of examples and making a rule out of it, right? So that would be an overgeneralization. Selective observation, and maybe we'll end with this one. Selective observation is you only see what you want, right? Often because you're trying to make a point, right? So if I think Dodge Ram drivers are terrible drivers, I'm going to focus on them when I'm on the road all the time, right? And that ultimately backs up my idea that they are bad drivers, right? I'm like, bad Dodge Ram driver, bad Dodge Ram driver, and I'm ignoring the bad BMW drivers that are all over the road as well, right? And I'm like, my observation suggests that Dodge Ram drivers are far worse because I'm only making observations that back up my thinking to begin with. And when you look at kind of sociological literature, you see a lot of this where people will actively kind of only look at the examples that support their case. Okay, leave it there. See you on Wednesday. We're going to blast through all of this on Wednesday, I hope, and then move on to something else on Friday.